Hi, welcome to Lights Camera Author. I'm Jim Juno, and this is a show where we talk with authors who write books about the entertainment industry, movies, and music. And I have with me today, he has a new book out. It's called The Beatle Who Vanished, 60th Beatles Anniversary Tour Version. It came out in May. Jim Berkenstadt, welcome to the show, Jim.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Now, if you're a Beatles aficionado, I'm sure you know that Ringo Starr was their drummer, and you might even know they had a drummer before Ringo named Pete Best. But what you may not know is that in 1964, for 10 days, the Beatles went on tour with a man named Jimmy Nicol. He played drums instead of Ringo. And tell me a little bit about how that happened, Jim.
The day before the Beatles' first world tour that was ever to take place, and one which took their manager, Brian Epstein, a year to put together because they all used snail mail in those days. No email, long distance calls were too expensive. So all the arrangements have been made over a year of sending letters to all these different promoters in different countries. And at 12 noon the day before, Ringo was with the Beatles and they were doing a photo shoot. And then they were going to go back over to what was then called EMI Studios. Now it's called Abbey Road. And they were going to do a recording session. And then they were going to go home, pack their bags, and take off for their first world tour the next day. But about noon, Ringo just crumpled to the floor and passed out. And I interviewed Neil Aspinall, their road manager at the time, and he said I just picked him up and carried him off to the hospital. And so that left a big dilemma because back in those days you could not just cancel a world tour. There was no insurance coverage for all the costs incurred by the promoters, all the people that put merchandise on the shelves in every city, etc. And there were no legal out clauses in contracts. So it was really a case of the show must go on. So as a result, Brian Epstein had to convince uh, John, Paul, and George to accept a substitute drummer.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney, they accepted the idea of a substitute drummer, but George Harrison was dead set against it, wasn't he?
Yes, that is true. Initially, he was dead set against it. He basically said, if Ringo's not coming, then we're really not the Beatles. And then he said he was going to not participate. And it took a lot of convincing to explain to him what many of us know nowadays, which was pop groups did not have a long shelf life in the 60s. They came and went, and they were replaced by others very quickly. And also, no one had ever attempted a world tour. So I don't think he understood the gravity of not just what it could mean in bad publicity and just knock them off completely, but the fact that they would have to financially repay the promoters, the hotels, the music instrument backup rental companies, all types of things that I found in the archives that they would have had to pay for because people had expended money expecting the Beatles to show up. So I think once all of these things were explained to George, he resigned himself to it and said, "All right, I'll do it." He wasn't happy, but he said he would do it. What's very interesting is in the new updated version of this book, I had interviewed one of the British reporters who went on tour with the Beatles, and he said that even though George was against it, that George, once Jimmy Nicol came on and was chosen, George was very kind to him, very helpful to him, and really welcomed him into the band.
That's great. I mean, and I would think that John Lennon would have something to say about substitute drummer. How did John feel about that?
Well, after John saw Jimmy come in the studio and they all played a set for about 20 minutes, and he realized how good Jimmy Nickel was, and something I dug up probably 10 years ago was that Jimmy Nickel had played these cover songs of Beatle tunes for a cheap record label that wanted to collect together hits onto 45s and fool the youth. And I think we had this going on in America too, by doing cover versions and making them think they were getting all the hits of the day on a 45 or an EP. And so Jimmy, since all
All
those
right.
top hits were Jimmy Nickel, he learned the ropes, and so John was very impressed with him knowing all of Ringo's parts.
Oh, that's great. Now how did they find Jimmy Nickel?
Right. Well, there were two drummers that were asked ahead of Jimmy Nickel that day to replace him, and they were both, one was just in a band and another was a studio session player. They both had previous commitments, so then the question was, well, who else can we find? What I discovered in finding some rare BBC footage was that Brian Epstein had brought one of his other artists to Decca Records to record, and Jimmy Nickel was the drummer on that session. And you see several moments on film where Brian is actually watching Jimmy Nickel play the drums. So he knew who he was. In the meantime, Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, who are still around today, had a big nightclub fan base, and a lot of those fans were members of rock groups. And Paul McCartney, as a bachelor, used to go to see them. And in May, Jimmy Nickel joined as their drummer to play live. And McCartney then knew who Jimmy Nickel was as well. So I think then they called George Martin and asked him to look into it. He then talked to the people that organized the sessions, and they gave him Jimmy Nickel's number, called him up, and said, "Get down to the studio."
And Nickel, they didn't tell Nickel that he was going to be replacing Ringo Starr. They just said, get to the studio. And
Right. And also, I don't think if he had known, he also didn't even own a suitcase at that time.
oh my gosh. So it's like, so he figured he was just going to go in and play a few sets with another band.
Right.
And instead he's walking in and there's the three Beatles there.
Yeah.
Now,
I think he was a little shell shocked.
I can imagine. I mean, now all drummers, if you know anything about music, all drummers have a specific style. Ringo had his style, and I'm sure Jimmy Nickel had his style.
Hmm.
And they were a little bit different, weren't they?
Right. Right. So, for example, Ringo had a lot of strength and played with his wrists and would hit the sticks onto the various drums and cymbals with a very hard crack using his wrists. Jimmy Nickel was a little more overhand with the arms, almost like I would compare it to Keith Moon, where people saw a lot of use of the arms, going all over. So also, Jimmy used to boost up his seat a little higher than most drummers would. Ringo was a little low in the seat. Jimmy got up higher because he felt that he could make a louder sound that way, coming down a little further, a little more arm strength. So yeah, just different styles, different styles on drum fills as well.
So he's going now. This is going to Australia, correct? That leg of the tour.
Well, that was the final stop for Jimmy. They first went to the Netherlands, then Hong Kong, then Australia. Hmm.
Okay, so he got to go to all those different places.
Right.
But it was only for 10 days, correct?
Yeah, I think it was 13 actually.
13.
Yeah,
Still,
so not very long.
yeah, but still, Denmark, did you say? And Hong Kong and Australia. That's quite a traveling.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to really be liking to travel going on tour like that.
I think he was I think he really loved traveling because he traveled his whole life to many different countries.
Was he, how did he fit in? I mean, because I remember the famous saying that, I thought I could party with the best of them until I saw these three guys.
Right. Well, socially, he was very fortunate that this happened, but I think they were just sort of getting to know each other, going to the Netherlands and Denmark, and then they flew back to London to catch a different plane to fly from London to Hong Kong. And that's a super long flight in the days of propeller airplanes. And it caused them to have to also stop to refuel two or three times along the way to Hong Kong. So it took forever to get there. So along the way, I think as soon as they took off, they discovered that guitarist Tony Sheridan was in the coach section. And they found it out and they asked the flight attendant to bring Tony Sheridan up into first class to join the Beatles. Well, what the Beatles didn't know was before they played with Tony Sheridan in Hamburg, Germany, and became friends with him and learned a lot from him, that in 1959, Jimmy Nicol had first played in groups with Tony Sheridan. So they had become good buddies in the very early 60s before the Beatles even came around. And so I think once the Beatles heard some of those stories from Tony Sheridan and Jimmy Nicol, and they both had Tony Sheridan in common, I just think that helped gel them on that long trip to Hong Kong, and then it just seemed like from there on, things just only got better socially.
One thing you just said, I find it surprising, but then again, this was 1964. The Beatles were flying passenger. They weren't flying private plane.
That's correct. Commercial air with all the rest of the people.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I would love to have been on one of those flights saying that, hey, guess who's in this? Guess who's up in first class, you know?
Right.
And
I think I even noticed that as a kid, I flew pretty early on, and my grandparents lived in San Diego. So there were oftentimes coming back from San Diego to Chicago, there were oftentimes celebrities on the flight up in first class. And, I think one time it was Jimmy Durante, and I was like, oh, I want to go up and meet Jimmy Durante because we have the same name and he's a comedian. So I went up there and just started chatting with him, and he goes, "What's your name?" And I said, "It's Jim." And he said, "Everybody's named Jim." But it was just kind of a funny thing that back then, these everyday celebrities were on the flights with the rest of us.
that is amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. That's something you do not see anymore nowadays.
I think
Uh,
you're right.
Now, what did Ringo feel? How did he feel about all this?
Um, it's my impression from talking to people in the Beatles inner circle that Ringo was in the hospital and he was seeing all the newsreels of the Beatles going around the world without him. And I believe that he felt insecure about that up until he actually flew back and rejoined them. But I think while he was there, he felt insecure because if you think about it, 2 years earlier, the Beatles had dumped Pete Best and picked up Ringo Starr. Now, 2 years later, Ringo's in the hospital and they have this new flashy drummer, Jimmy Nicol, with him. So I think maybe all of us might have felt a little insecure. However, I think the one thing he might not have realized is the Beatles were four brothers. They weren't just a band. They were really like four brothers, very, very close. So I don't think Ringo had anything to worry about. Even if Jimmy had been a better drummer, and that's all subjective, I think they still would have welcomed him back as they did because he was like their fourth brother.
Yeah, and now let's talk a little bit about that. Where now Jimmy Nicol, he on the other side of the coin, he's performing with the Beatles night in and night out. They seem to like him. They're and they seem to be accepting him. He starts to think, hey, maybe this is a permanent gig for me.
I believe you're right. I think he did start to believe that maybe with everything going so well, the Beatles might say, well, why don't we bring in Jimmy now in place of Ringo Starr? But again, I don't think he realized that, even though things were going well, which was to his credit and to the Beatles' credit, they played very well in concert without Ringo. I just don't think that that he realized that factor of what I said was like they were like brothers, and there was no way that, especially George, would not have allowed Ringo to be fired at that point. He would have probably quit, and the whole thing would have fallen apart. So I just think it's interesting that he, felt very hopeful and optimistic, but it just wasn't to be.
Now, at the end of 13 days, Ringo is on his way back to rejoin his brothers, the Beatles, and that's when Brian Epstein. Well, I think that wasn't it that Jimmy Nichols said something that how he really liked doing it or whatever, and Brian Epstein really kind of shut him down.
Well, what happened was after Ringo rejoined, there were now 5 Beatles running around in front of the media. They went up on a roof and waved to everybody down below, which was about 100 or 200,000 people. And then they went inside for a press conference. So there were, it was John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Jimmy were all at the table. But if you're able to find clips of the press conference, as I was, you'll see that Jimmy is sort of off to the left, and the 4 original Beatles there are sort of huddled together around Ringo. And most of the questions were focused not on Jimmy Nicol as they maybe some of them had been in the past. It was really focused on Ringo, you're back. Are you going to sing? Are you still going to be able to sing tonight because you had tonsillitis? And what was it like? Yada yada. So they're talking to the 4, and then Jimmy felt a little left out. So there was another reporter just sort of kneeling down next to the table, and he started sort of doing a side interview at the same time with Jimmy. Unfortunately, Jimmy maybe didn't realize he had a live mic for the press conference. So he was starting to interrupt and drown out the other Beatles who were principally being interviewed by all the rest of the media. And that's what made Brian Epstein blow up, because he just felt that was really inappropriate behavior and unprofessional. And so when I spoke to the drummer for one of the other bands that would lead up to the Beatles in concert from Sounds Incorporated. And he said, I was there after the press conference, and Brian just really was angry at him and lectured him and said, I want you to go straight upstairs and pack and stay in your room. And so Jimmy really kind of rebelled against that. He was a very independent person, and he did not like being told, in no uncertain terms, sit in your room like a kid, pack your bags and sit in your room. So that night when the Beatles were all partying and, having friends up, he snuck out of the hotel, went to a pub to have drinks. And when Epstein asked where he was and found out he was gone, he sent Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans to go look for him. And they located him. And Jimmy said it was really wild. All of a sudden, these 2 guys rushed in and said, hey, you have to get back to the hotel. And Jimmy said, why do I have to go back to the hotel? I'm not a Beatle anymore. And they said, you are a Beatle until we put you on that plane.
And that came rather quickly too, didn't it?
Right. And what's interesting is during most of the tour, Jimmy was fine and was able to go places like visit, areas of cities and things while the Beatles stayed in their rooms, because he was not really recognized by the public. And he was able to be independent. Once Brian Epstein came back on the last full day for him, things changed because Epstein was very careful about protecting the Beatles' reputations. And so that's why he didn't want Jimmy roaming around. You know, if Jimmy had gotten into a fight or some sort of problem, it would have reflected badly on the Beatles. So things really changed quite quickly, 180 degrees, when Epstein got back with Ringo.
Now, the title of the book is The Beatle Who Vanished. Uh, why did he vanish, and how did you rediscover him?
Great questions. So I think that within a year after the his time with the Beatles, he had tried to launch two different bands, solo bands, and it was his thought from talking to some of those other band members that Jimmy really wanted to compete against the Beatles on the album charts. He figured, having been on the inside in the inner circle, he knew how to do it. But he made, in my opinion, he made several mistakes. He spent all of the money he had made with the Beatles and just in general from his session work, which was quite lucrative. And he hired session musicians, which are far more expensive to hire than just finding other people who play good instruments and know how to go out on tour. The reason is that session players can earn a much greater living in those days in the studio playing 2 sessions a day than they could going on tour with Jimmy Nicol. The other thing, besides spending all that money on them, he also didn't realize that, once those big headlines that were all the time when he first returned from the tour, fifth Beatle returns, fifth Beatle starts a new band, all this stuff. Once those things start to fade and the news goes on to other things, other newer news, then what happened was he started to have fewer and fewer, selling fewer tickets. Fewer people were showing up. So the venues got smaller, etc. So he did that, as the money ran out, he couldn't really afford the session players. He went into debt. And at the same time, all the songs that the 3 songs he recorded and tried to put out just didn't chart. And in one case, I think it was called Baby Please Don't Go. He recorded the song, and across town, Van Morrison with his group then called Them recorded the same exact song, and only they had Jimmy Page on lead guitar and Van Morrison on lead vocals. And Jimmy Nicol's band had a nobody on vocals and no guitarist like Jimmy Page. So you can guess which song raced up the charts and which song never made it out of the starting gate. So he made a lot of mistakes. I think ego kind of entered into it as well. And by summer of 65, Jimmy Nicol was divorced, bankrupt, out of work, just didn't have anything going on. So he just, according to musician friends I spoke to that had known him all those years in London, they said he just walked out the door and disappeared. And many of these people never saw him again from 65 till now. So I really had my work cut out for me. I had to figure out where he went. And I think it really wasn't known, until I wrote this book and researched it, where all the places were that he went to. Each time things wouldn't quite work out, he would vanish and then move on to another country, another place. So I think that the way I found that he went to Sweden with the Spotniks is I took a close look at all of the places he went with his first solo band after the Beatles, called Jimmy Nicol and the Shubdubs. And I found that he had gone to Denmark. And I looked at the other bands on the bill, and then I started reaching out to them and saying, do you have any idea where Jimmy went after? And one of the people I reached out to was a keyboard player for the Spotniks. And he said, oh, we we had him come here to Gothenburg because our drummer wasn't allowed to tour anymore after he got married. And so we needed a drummer, and we thought it would be really cool to get a drummer who had played with the Beatles. So that led me to the next little chapter in his life of 2 years traveling the world and recording with the Spotniks. So there's always some little thing, like none of the Spotniks knew what happened to Jimmy after he left their band, but he left them in Mexico. So I looked all over Jimmy Nickel, Mexico, etc. Nothing came up. Now there'd be plenty of things after the book came out. But then I decided to search for someone like myself, a music historian, but an expert in Mexican rock and roll. And as soon as I wrote to him, he wrote back immediately and said, "Oh yeah, I know a lot about what Jimmy did, and he stayed here in Mexico, and he married this woman, and here's her phone number." And so every now and then you get lucky, and then it just leads you on to the next thing. The other thing is when you interview someone, you could say, "Well, where did that person go next? Or do you know anything about who they were, where they went, or what they did next?" So it was a long trail. It took 6 years of research to write the original story, and then it has taken me the last 10 years since the book came out to find out really what happened. Is he dead or alive? If he's alive, where does he live? So that was a whole nother difficult search, because I had finally tracked him down to about 2005 in London. And by the time I went over to visit and try to meet with him, he had left England. He'd left the whole country again. So it's been a long, tough search, but now people who read it, they'll know what happened.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. If you want to find out what happened to Jimmy Nickel, you got to get the book. And the book is The Beatle Who Vanished, the 60th Anniversary Tour Edition. The author is Jim Berkenstadt. And Jim, I want to thank you again for being on Life Camera Author today.
Thanks very much, Jim. I really appreciate being on. And also, readers can go to either Amazon.com, or if they'd like a signed copy, they can go to thebeatlewhovanished.com. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you again.
All right. Take care, Jim.